Ever get that, like, just awful feeling of being treated unfairly?
Yeah.
Now, crank that feeling up 100 times because you're being denied something totally basic, like a place to live. That's what we're getting into today, the emotional toll of housing discrimination.
Yeah.
It's often overlooked, you know. We've got some seriously interesting legal articles and studies that you all send in, and the one we're using as our main guide is this piece from the Fordham Urban Law Journal, Emotional Harm in Housing Discrimination Cases, a new look at a lingering problem.
It really dives deep into the human side of things, how discrimination just keeps impacting people's lives even after they've managed to find somewhere else to live.
We're going to unpack how it's not just, like, hurt feelings. This stuff can have heavy consequences for people's mental and physical health, and we'll get to why it's relevant to everyone, even if you haven't personally been through housing discrimination.
It's a powerful example of how the mind and body connect, how stress can actually show up as physical symptoms. The article lists all sorts of stuff: anxiety, feeling humiliated, trouble sleeping, even ulcers and headaches. Sometimes it even makes existing health conditions worse. It really makes you realize this isn't just something you're imagining, you know?
Totally. And the crazy thing is, we have the Fair Housing Act, which is supposed to prevent this kind of discrimination. It's been around for decades. But the article points out that discrimination is still a huge problem.
Right. And something that's really interesting here is that the article compares this emotional harm to something called the tort of intentional infliction of emotional distress.
Whoa. Okay, that sounds super legally. Can you break that down for us?
Think of it as like someone is purposely doing something outrageous to cause you serious emotional pain. And the article makes it clear how the legal system, it often just doesn't grasp how serious this harm is.
Why is that? Is it just, like, hard to prove?
Well, yeah, that's part of it. Putting a dollar amount on emotional pain is a lot tougher than, say, on a broken leg. But there's something else going on, too. The legal system likes to use this reasonable person idea to judge harm.
Okay, but what's wrong with that? Shouldn't everyone react in a reasonable way to a situation?
Sure, in theory, yeah. But the problem is trauma, especially racial trauma, doesn't always fit neatly into what a reasonable person would do. Everyone reacts differently. What might seem like an overreaction to one person could be completely traumatic to someone else.
So you're saying someone could basically be told their pain isn't reasonable enough, even though it's completely real for them?
Exactly. And the article points out that there's evidence of racial bias, right, within the courts themselves, which just makes all of this even more complicated.
Wait, hold on. You mean the very people who are supposed to be protecting these victims might be biased against them?
Unfortunately, yeah. There's research showing that even subconsciously, white people can associate negative traits with black people, even if they're behaving in the same way. This implicit bias can affect how a judge or jury sees a victim's story, whether they believe that the harm is real and how serious it is.
Wow. This checklist the article talks about could be huge for victims who struggle to put their experiences into words. If they have a way to identify those emotional and physical effects, to actually document what they've gone through, that would be powerful, not just for them personally, but to build a stronger legal case, too.
Totally. It's about making what's invisible visible, giving them concrete evidence that the courts can understand and judge fairly. The good thing is the article doesn't just lay out the problem. It gets into potential solutions, ways to make the system actually deal with this human cost of discrimination.
Okay, good. I'm ready for some good news. What are some of the things we can do to start tackling this?
Well, one of the key things the article highlights is that we need more diversity among judges and lawyers.
Makes sense to me. If the people making decisions haven't experienced this kind of bias themselves, it must be harder to really grasp how much it impacts people's lives, right?
Right. And it goes beyond just representation. It's about training, too.
Mm-hmm.
The article points out that a lot of mental health professionals, even the ones who truly want to help, they might not have the specific expertise to diagnose and treat the trauma that comes from housing discrimination.
Yeah, that really struck me too. It's like you could have the most empathetic therapist in the world, but if they haven't been trained to recognize the unique trauma of housing discrimination, they could miss key things or not fully get how much damage has been done.
Exactly. We need therapists and lawyers who have the tools and knowledge to correctly diagnose and treat this specific type of trauma. It can't just be about listening. It's got to be about understanding the legal side of things, the psychological impacts, and the long-term consequences.
I remember that statistic from the article about how few psychiatrists are African American. It was chilling. It just shows how far we have to go to create a system that's truly inclusive, and actually meets everyone's needs.
Absolutely. It's a real wake-up call that representation matters, not just so people can see themselves reflected, but so they can get culturally competent care and someone who can advocate for them.
So how do we actually start making these changes? It feels like such a massive problem. Like, where do we even begin?
Well, the good news is the article doesn't just diagnose the problem, it gives us a call to action. It lays out some concrete steps to create a more just system. And remember that checklist we mentioned before? That's a great starting point. It gives victims a way to articulate what they've been through and creates a structure for gathering evidence that can be used in court.
I'm so glad we're circling back to that checklist. It's more than just a form. It's like giving a voice to people who've been silenced. It's making the invisible visible. What kind of questions does it ask specifically?
It's designed to get into the details of how housing discrimination has impacted someone's life. Things like, how has this messed with your sleep, your relationships, your ability to work or go to school? Has it brought up any past traumas? Has it given you new fears or anxieties? It really gets to the core of how discrimination has these ripple effects across a person's entire life.
So it's like helping them connect the dots between the discrimination and the emotional and physical fallout, helping them see the full extent of the harm they've suffered.
Exactly. It encourages them to really think about their experience and become more self-aware, which can be incredibly helpful in itself. And legally speaking, it creates a detailed record of the victim's experience, so it's harder for their pain to be dismissed or minimized.
I love how it works on those two levels, empowering people to understand and talk about their own experience, and also giving them something concrete to use when fighting for their rights. It's like a bridge between what's personal and the whole system.
That's a great way to put it. And keep in mind, the article focuses on racial discrimination in housing, but what it says applies to other kinds of discrimination too. Whether it's based on gender, disability, family status, anything, the emotional toll is real, and we desperately need a system that's more responsive.
It's about recognizing the humanity in everyone who's been marginalized and denied equal opportunity. Speaking of solutions, I'm curious to hear more about what the article suggests beyond the checklist. What else can we do to tackle this?
You got it. It's about making things fair, creating a system where everyone's voice matters and their experiences are taken seriously. And that leads us to one of the most promising solutions in the article, getting more diversity among judges and lawyers.
I was really glad they brought that up. It's something I've thought about a lot. If the people making the decisions haven't experienced this kind of bias, how can they really get what it does to people?
Exactly. Having different life experiences, different perspectives in the courtroom, it can lead to a much deeper understanding of discrimination and how complex it is. It goes beyond just knowing the law. It's about getting the human cost.
And it's not just about race either, right? Think about all the other ways people face discrimination in housing women, people with disabilities, families with kids. We need diversity across the board to make sure everyone's experiences are understood and acknowledged.
Absolutely right. We need a legal system that actually reflects how diverse our society is. And that means having judges and lawyers from all walks of life bringing their unique perspectives.
Yeah.
The article also talks about how important training is. You know, even with the best intentions, a lot of legal and mental health professionals might not have the right expertise to handle these cases effectively.
Yeah, I really connected with that part. It's like, even if you have a therapist who's incredibly empathetic and really wants to help, if they haven't been trained to recognize the specific trauma that comes with housing discrimination, they might miss important signs or not see the full extent of the harm.
Exactly. We need therapists and lawyers who have the tools and knowledge to properly diagnose and treat this very specific kind of trauma. It's more than just listening. It's about understanding the legal nuances, the psychological impact, and the long-term consequences.
I remember that statistic from the article about how few psychiatrists are African American. It was just chilling. It really hit home how much work we need to do to build a system that's truly inclusive and responsive to everyone's needs.
It is. It's a stark reminder that representation matters, not just so people can see themselves reflected, but so they can get care and support that's culturally sensitive from people who understand where they're coming from.
So how do we actually make these changes happen? It seems like such a huge systemic problem. Where do we even start?
Well, the good thing is the article doesn't just point out the problem. It tells us what we can do. It gives us a call to action. It lays out some concrete steps to move toward a more just system. And don't forget that checklist we talked about earlier. That's a fantastic starting point. It gives victims a way to explain what they've been through and provides a framework for gathering evidence that they can use in court.
I'm so glad we're coming back to that checklist. It's more than just a form. It's about giving power back to people who've been silenced, you know?
Mhm.
It's making the invisible visible. So what kind of questions are on it specifically?
It's designed to really dig into the ways housing discrimination has affected someone's life. Things like, how has this messed with your sleep? Your relationships? Can you work or go to school like you used to? Did it bring up any past traumas? Has it caused any new fears or anxieties? It really gets to the heart of how discrimination creates these ripple effects across a person's whole life.
It's like it's helping them connect the dots, right? Between the discrimination and the fallout, emotional and physical, to help them see the true scope of what they've been through.
Exactly. It encourages them to really examine their experiences and become more aware of themselves, which can be incredibly therapeutic on its own. And from a legal perspective, it creates this detailed record of what they've gone through. So it's much harder to just dismiss or minimize their pain.
I love that it works on both of those levels, giving people the power to understand and talk about their own experiences, but also creating something solid they can use when they're fighting for their rights. It's like a bridge between the personal and the whole system.
That's a perfect way to put it. And remember, the article might focus on racial discrimination in housing, but what it's saying applies to all kinds of discrimination.
Hmm.
Gender, disability, family status, whatever it might be, the emotional toll is real, and we desperately need a system that can respond effectively.
It's about recognizing the humanity in everyone who's been marginalized and denied equal opportunity. And speaking of solutions, I'm curious to hear more about what the article suggests beyond this checklist. What else can we do to tackle this big issue?
It feels like we've really uncovered a lot, the invisible wounds of emotional harm, the systemic roadblocks that make it so hard to get justice. But it's good to know there are solutions, actual ways to address this. So, beyond the checklist and increasing diversity in legal and medical fields, what else does the article suggest?
Well, it definitely doesn't sugarcoat things, but it really does lay out a path forward. It calls for a kind of like multi-pronged approach,
Mhm.
one that tackles this from all sides, you know, individual empowerment, systemic reform, changing how society views this, and building empathy.
That's what I like about it. It doesn't just dump the problem on us, it actually gives us tools and ideas to start making things better. So let's break down those other angles. What are some concrete things we can do to create a housing system that's more fair and just? One thing the article stresses is that mental health professionals need more specialized training. Even the ones who really want to help might not have the knowledge or skills to really diagnose and treat the trauma that comes from housing discrimination.
Makes sense. Trauma can show up in so many different ways, and it's crucial to have therapists who can recognize those unique patterns and challenges that specifically come from this experience.
Exactly. It's about giving therapists the tools to help victims work through their trauma, find coping mechanisms, and rebuild their sense of self-worth, which is often really damaged by discrimination. The article also talks about the importance of culturally competent care, making sure therapists understand those cultural nuances and sensitivities that might be at play.
It's about creating a safe space where people can heal and feel like they're truly seen, heard, and understood, right? And beyond therapy, the article also pushes for policy changes that would make fair housing laws stronger and give more teeth to enforcement.
For sure. It's about closing those loopholes, making the penalties tougher for people who break the law, and giving victims more resources to actually seek justice. The article also talks about public awareness campaigns, educating people about their rights and what they're responsible for under fair housing laws.
It's about shifting the whole narrative, making it crystal clear that housing discrimination isn't just a personal problem, it's a societal one. It demands our attention and action. So, what can our listeners do to be part of the solution? What are some tangible steps they can take to actually make a difference?
Well, first off, share this episode with someone who needs to hear it. Spread the word about how much housing discrimination hurts people emotionally, and let them know about resources that can help. Support organizations that are out there fighting for fair housing and push for policy changes in your own communities.
I love that. Knowledge is power, right? The more we understand about this issue, the better we can challenge it. And it doesn't have to be about big, sweeping actions. Sometimes it's the small, everyday choices we make.
Totally agree. Be aware of your own biases, and when you see discrimination happening, call it out. Support businesses and groups that promote diversity and inclusion. Speak up for people who are marginalized. Help amplify their voices.
Every time we raise awareness, every conversation we have, every choice we make, all of it contributes to building a world that's more just and equitable. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave everyone with a thought to chew on. The article focused a lot on housing discrimination based on race, but as we've been talking about, this problem goes way beyond race.
It's a reminder to look deeper and think about how other kinds of bias based on gender, disability, family status, sexual orientation, all of it can affect whether someone has access to housing that's safe and affordable.
It all boils down to this. Everyone deserves a place they can call home, a place where they feel safe, respected, and valued. And it's on all of us to work towards a world where that's the reality for everyone, not just a lucky few.
That's a powerful way to put it. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. And don't forget to check out the show notes for that checklist we talked about, plus some more resources and ways to get involved.
Absolutely. This conversation doesn't stop here. Let's keep learning, sharing, and pushing for change. Until next time, keep diving deep.